Are you ready for a list of the chapter books that we have read throughout this school year? Pretty excited to share with you from this whole stack, plus some more that would not fit in my hands right now, of all of the chapter books that we have read together this year. Hi, I'm Julia. Thanks for joining me on this video. My channel is Freestyling It at Sharing the Discovery Homeschool. Because I've got a whole stack of books, I'm going to share just a couple things about each book with you. I'm going to share the title, the author, why we started reading it, and whether we liked it or not. So 4 things about each book. Hopefully this will keep the video from dragging on for too long, as this is quite a stack. So first book we read is 5 True Dog Stories by Margaret Davidson. We got this book out because we were talking about dogs together, and it was in my mom's homeschooling library that she has given me at this point. We did like this book. All of the stories kept my children's interest, and we enjoyed learning about how dogs are helpful to humans in different situations. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. We read this book because there was a reference, actually the quote, "I'm melting, melting," which is from the movie actually, but I happened to make that quote for some reason with my kids one day, and they're like, "Where's that from?" And so I pulled this out and I thought, let's give this a try. This was the first chapter book, big chapter book, that we read together, and for the most part they were well engaged. It's great because it has lots of food for the imagination. The Sword in the Tree by Clyde Robert Bulla. My son actually found this in the stack of my mom's homeschool library, and he requested to read this, and I put him off for a little bit, but when we finally did sit down to read it, he enjoyed it and he was able to engage the story. The Boxcar Children by Gertrude Chandler Warner. This was one of my favorite books when I was growing up, and so I was excited to be able to share it with my own children. Simple text, simple stories. There's that orphan element, which I think appeals to a lot of kids, the idea of pretending that they're on their own and having to make ends meet for themselves. Definitely a recommendation. Dolphin Adventure from Wayne Grover. This is a true story about a man who dives with some dolphins, has an incredible experience with some dolphins while deep sea diving. My children enjoy this. I think I pulled this out of my mom's homeschool library because we were having conversations about the ocean life and such. I'm going to segue here to just offer a couple of examples of books that we started to read but didn't finish reading. The first one, kind of jumping off the Boxcar Children, is Mountaintop Mystery by Gertrude Chandler Warner. We started reading it. It was interesting at first, but it just kind of seemed to not carry. Dolphin Treasure, also by Wayne Grover, which is the sequel to the Dolphin Adventure. We tried it, and it just didn't seem as gripping, and this is quite possibly because of what age my children are at right now. I think the story was a little bit less exciting and more detailed. In Grandma's Attic by Arleta Richardson. This is one of my favorites growing up. I really enjoyed this, and so when I started the first chapter with the kids earlier on in this school year, and it wasn't grabbing their interest, I thought to myself, I'm not going to force this. I know this is a good book, and I'm just going to wait until it, can resonate with them and there's more interest there. Another book that we started reading but didn't finish is Emily's Runaway Imagination by Beverly Cleary. We honestly didn't get very far in this, maybe just into the first chapter. Again, I think it was an age thing with my kids, just not quite ready. More descriptive passages rather than conversations and interactions, which I think would have held their interest, and maybe that comes later on in the book. So yeah, I definitely want to come back to several of these books, but I just I'm not of the mind to force things if they're not catching the interest. I think there's plenty more books in the world that we don't need to force a reading. The Wheel on the School. This is by Amandar Jejon. I've talked about this in other videos. My kids loved this book. They would beg for me to read more chapters, and we got this far. And then the interest petered off. And I can see why. The story did slow down quite a bit. And it was a little bit less adventuresome. But the beginning of this book was just great. I think that even just reading the beginning of the book was enough of a story for them. So, and just a word about not forcing reading something. I think there was another book that we picked up at one point, and we started the first chapter, and all of us were like, yeah, this isn't catching us. And just being okay with that. I think that sometimes as homeschool parents, we can feel like we need to make it happen. We need to make that connection. We need to make our children love books, or we need to make them do everything that's required in the curriculum layout. And I'm not of that opinion. I believe that children are going to learn, and that the learning process starts before the curriculum comes in. And in fact, children are natural, avid learners. And if I can tap into what's already going on, if I can come on the school scene with the reverence for the learning that's already taking place, I think that helps all of us, that we can all participate in the learning together, and that I am the homeschool parent. I'm not trying to force them to come to any conclusions or to read anything that they're not entirely interested in, etc., etc. Now, does this mean that there aren't some days where my kids are like, can we stop the chapter here or whatever? And I'll say, well, we've got one more page. Let's press through. So it doesn't mean that I'm not encouraging them to finish what they've started, or to just kind of get out of work or get out of whatever. That's not what I'm wanting to impart to them. But I do want to impart to them the desire to read. And I think that happens when reading is not a chore. Okay. Back to the list. Even though we didn't read Emily's Runaway Imagination, we did read Henry Huggins by Beverly Cleary. This book became a part of our reading list because it was in my mom's homeschool library, which, by the way, are all books that are in the Sonlight curriculum or have been in the past. So Henry Huggins was a Sonlight book, and so I pulled it out as just let's just read this book next. And yes, it was a hit. Everybody enjoyed the story of Henry Huggins and his dog, Ribsy. The Littles by John Peterson is also a Sonlight book, and was one of my favorites growing up. I loved the adventures of this family of tiny people who have tails. This is the first book of the series, and my kids enjoyed imagining these little people living in a big person house. I recommend this book, and the subsequent titles in the series are also well worth the read, although we haven't read any of them yet. This book is called I Survived: The Destruction of Pompeii, AD 79. This is by Lauren Tarshish. There was a lot of interest surrounding volcanoes for a bit there, especially with my older son. So I just did a search on what kids' books might be around. This was a chapter book that was at our local library, and so we read this together, which was interesting, to say the least. The Year of Miss Agnes by Kirkpatrick Hill. Now, this book is a Sonlight book, but in addition to that, it was Read Aloud's revival chapter book of a season. So that's the reason why I had pulled it out at this time, to read together along with Read Aloud Revival's recommendations. I would like to read it again when my children are older, because there's a lot to be gleaned here, and I think that some of the meaning, some of the nuances, some of the story was lost on them a little bit, although it was enough to keep them in it. We definitely could enjoy the story, and there were a lot of things topics when we didn't understand things, we took a moment to discuss them. So anyway, The Year of Miss Agnes. The Paintbrush Kid by Clyde Robert Bulla. I had never read this book, even though it is a part of the Sonlight curriculum, or has been, and this is a really great story. I I had pulled it out just as another option, being like, yep, let's read this book next. This looks like it will grab my kids, and lo and behold, yes, it did. And the same with this one as well. This is called The Chalkbox Kid by Clyde Robert Bulla, and same thing. I had it on the shelf, and I pulled it out, and I said, let's read this one next, and yes, it successfully grabbed their attention, all of our imaginations, and yes, a very moving book. Both of these books are about Gregory and how he uses his creative ability to impact his neighborhood. Tales of Robin Hood. Now this is illustrated by Ron Tyner. Now I had gotten this book out because we had come across a reference to it in the Year of Miss Agnes. In the Year of Miss Agnes, they were reading the Story of Robin Hood together as a part of their class, as part of their school. And so I thought, hey, I'm going to get this Tales of Robin Hood checked out of the library, and we're going to read this and kind of get in on what the story of Robin Hood is. This is a Sonlight book as well, which is how I knew to order this exact copy, but it has really, really wonderful illustrations. Another Beverly Cleary book, Ralph S. Mouse, also a really great choice from Cleary's selection of titles. Read Aloud Revival had a season where they said select a Beverly Cleary book, and I think that their recommendation was Henry Huggins. However, we had already read Henry Huggins, so I found another book by her that I thought we would enjoy, and yes, we did enjoy this. Ralph S. Mouse. It has a motorcycle in it, so my son is all gung-ho over motorcycles. This book is House of Robots by James Patterson. Now, this would never be a book I would pull off the shelf and say, yes, let's read this together. The reason why we even had this as an option is because it's in the Sonlight, or it was in the Sonlight Summer Reading Guide for 2021. And so I thought, hey, that must be full of good options, right? So I ordered all of the books that were in the Sonlight summer catalog. When this came into the house, my son gravitated towards it, and so we read it together. And it was an interesting story. It's a lot of cartoonish illustrations here. I did edit some parts out, like if the character was saying the word stupid, I would say the word silly, or, just little things like that. That it's like, sure, you can give it a shrug, but I don't really want, several of those words to become words that my children can turn to in times where they may be frustrated or want to say something nasty. My daughter Jasmine here with me. She popped in for just a minute here. The other book that we read that was recommended by the Sonlight Summer Reading List is The Case of the Stolen Sixpence. This is by Holly Webb. It looked like something we might all enjoy, and indeed we did enjoy it. It was a mystery and some fun characters in it, and a satisfying resolution.
The doggy, and I just love it because I just love the outside of it, and so I love Mama.
The Story of Dr. Doolittle by Hugh Lofting. I picked this story out of the Sonlight library that my mom had because I thought that this would be a hit with my kids, and yes, it was a hit. Great food for the imagination in The Story of Dr. Doolittle. The Little Riders by Margarita Shemin. This book is one that I remember my mom reading as a part of school, so I had this in her school books, and I remember really being drawn to the story, and I think that it had a similar effect on my children. It's set in World War II. It's told from the point of view of a little girl who lives in occupied Holland. The story is very relational, and there is just a really beautiful element to it where a German soldier, actually an officer, is assigned to live in their home, and the way that the little girl relates to him is so hard at first. She hates Germans for good reason. There's reason for her to greatly dislike, the enemy, and for the story to humanize the German officer in this little girl's eyes. It's just an amazing story, and the kids liked it. It has some action, some suspense in it, so definitely worth the read. And I'm just seeing on the back here, it says ages 9 and up, and perhaps that might be for like reading solo, but definitely books that are, said for older ages can be read aloud to younger ages. The Light at Tern Rock by Julia L. Sauer. This is a Newbery Honor book, as you can see, and it is a Sonlight book as well. This is a book that I might just recommend to be read just for anyone, really. A worthy, beautiful story, and one that has themes of forgiveness, themes of hard work ethic. So, The Light at Tern Rock. The Family Under the Bridge by Natalie Savage Carlson, also a Newbery Honor book. I picked this book out because the chapter book recommendation by Read Aloud Revival for the season was one that was a little bit above my children's level, even for Read Aloud. The story that Read Aloud Revival had was a story about siblings, orphans who needed to stick together, and I knew that The Family Under the Bridge was also about orphans who needed to choose to stick together, and so I thought, let's read this one because it kind of can stand in place. This is also a Sonlight book, and I will say that towards the end it was a little bit of a push to finish it. This was one of the books that I said, let's just try to finish it. We're like, one chapter away from the conclusion, but it did slow down towards the end. And I'm not sure if there was any particular reason why my kids lost interest, but yeah, it was what it was. We read it all the way through, and it captured our interest long enough for us to at least finish the story together. My Father's Dragon by Ruth Stiles Gannett. This is another one of those great imaginative books that just takes the readers to an imaginary place where animals can talk and the extraordinary happens. So this was a Sonlight book, and that's why I picked it out, because I knew that it would be a quality read. This is The Toothpaste Millionaire, and the author isn't here, by Jean Merrill. This was a Sonlight book, and we were learning about currency and money for a week, and so I had picked this out kind of as a tie-in to that theme, because this story is all about a young boy and his good friend, how they partner together to make toothpaste and basically create a whole business selling toothpaste. It talks about the risks that they take, the challenges that they encounter, and the way they succeed. So this book was really great for a number of reasons. It tied into several themes that came after that I didn't even know that we would be covering, such as race in America. I didn't know when I pulled this out if it would grab my kids. Some chapters in here that we did kind of push through a little bit, where there was a lot of figures, as far as like money figures and kind of working things out from a financial standpoint, that I think went a little bit over their heads. McBroom's Wonderful 1 Acre Farm by Sid Fleischman. This is just 3 tales put together about McBroom's Wonderful 1 Acre Farm, and they are just out of this world, kind of funny, hilarious stories for kids. I pulled it off the shelf because it was a Sonlight book and I knew that it was going to be fun. The Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White. This I had never read before. This is not a Sonlight book. I had ordered this from the library because it was recommended in God's World News, the parent-teacher guide. And so I got this out because it was going to be related to our week in the current events world. And we read it previous to the week of exploring swans. And it just set us up perfectly for our learning about swans in God's World News. This is a great story. My son especially loved it, but both kids were well engaged. 2 more books to go. A Long Road on a Short Day by Gary D. Schmidt and Elizabeth Stickney. This is a new book. It was published in 2021. I loved this story, honestly. This actually reminds me of another book that I read for school, which was called The 17th Swap. But basically, it tells the story of taking a good, an item, in this case, a Barlow knife, and swapping it for something else in order to get the final product that they had set out for. And it took a number of different swaps to finally get the item that would swap for the cow that they had originally gone for. This was a book Sarah Mackenzie at Read Aloud Revival suggested as a tie-in to the Oxcart Man, to our month with the Oxcart Man, and it certainly tied in very well with goods and services and trading and learning the value of things, and a great story told from a little boy's perspective. And the last book to conclude our books for the year, we ended off with Addie's Story Collection by Connie Porter. This story was not something I would have considered probably, but I went to Read Aloud Revival's site looking for a Christmas chapter book that we could read at the end of this last year, and one of the books that she had recommended was Addies Surprise, which is the Christmas story in the Addie series. When I had thought about getting this from the library, I thought I might just get the Christmas story. And then I saw that there was a collection available, and I thought, let's do this just in case my kids really like it and they want to read all of the stories. And lo and behold, that was the case. We read through all of the stories. They didn't lose interest. Her first book in the series happens when her and her mom escape to get to freedom. And that's what the Meet Addie story is about. And then all of the subsequent books are about her living her life, her free life in Philadelphia. I thought that's perfect. We have been talking about slavery in the U.S. This is a great way to tie in and just kind of bring closure to all that we've been learning. We actually didn't read the first story. We didn't read Meet Addie. We started out just as another book that we started but we didn't conclude. There was mention of like whipping, and there was that scary element of not knowing if they would make it to freedom. Her father got sold before her and her mom escaped, and it did just seem a little bit too intense for my kids. So we skipped over Meet Addie, and we started up with her already in Philadelphia, and her mom setting about the business of getting their lives ordered in that place and figuring out how to live in freedom. There is plenty that happens in the pages. There's plenty of action and dialogue, and definitely something that I would recommend as worthwhile as this American Girl series for Addie. So, wow, that was a big stack and a lot of reading that we've done this year. So I know I've said this in other videos, but usually when we read first thing in the morning, and it's when my kids are sitting down at the breakfast table having their breakfast meal. I consider it so important to their development, whether it be emotional, whether it be intellectual, etc. And so I place a high priority on reading aloud. Also being for them to be able to learn vocabulary and geography and history. All of these things can be combined in a read aloud. Never mind just the imaginative aspect of it, of reading books that are just a little bit out there, that provide so much food for thought and food for the imagination. So we read first thing. I usually read a chapter or two. Sometimes, if it's a really good book, we will go, 3 or 4 chapters before I have to finally say, let's do something else with our day. And we'll either do something else for school, or we're going out somewhere for an outing or something of the like. But we always try to get read aloud done in the morning for 5 days a week, Monday through Friday usually. We don't often read on Saturday, but that's not a hard, fast rule. Sometimes we do read on Saturdays, depending on the book we're reading and the time that we have, etc. I will say that my daughter did not always sit and listen to the whole chapter. She would be there for the beginning of each chapter, and we would read at breakfast time. So when she finished her breakfast, she often hopped down from the table and went to go play. Sometimes within earshot, other times not. And to me, that was totally fine. Usually my son stayed put. But if he did show signs of getting restless and like he was ready to go and play, I would try to find a break in the text, or I would say we've just got a little bit farther. So that gives a little overview of what we do in our read aloud. And I am excited. We have started our first book of this next year, and so I will be compiling a list again, and hopefully I can share it with you all again at the end of next year. All right, well, thanks for joining me today.